I have run the ferry and the relay station at Cobb's Crossing for 50 years, and in all that time I only ever told one lie that mattered. And it was a lie I told without meaning to, with my own two hands. On the morning the Antler River came up over its banks and took the spring mail down to the sea. But I am ahead of myself, and an old man is allowed that. Let me tell it the way it happened, the way I watched it, because I watched all of it, every year of it, from the window of the station house where the trail bends down to the water. It begins with a stranger fording the river. He came in the low light of an April evening, a big man on a dust-gray gelding, and he put the horse into the Antler at the shallow run below the ferry without waiting for me to pole the flat across to him, the way a man does who has crossed harder water than this and does not much care to be helped. The river was up with the snowmelt, and it dragged at the gelding's legs, and the man sat the saddle loose and easy and let the horse pick its own line. And when they came up the near bank streaming and blowing, he looked at the station house, and he looked at the town strung out along the rise behind it, and something went out of his face. I was on the porch with my pipe gone cold in my hand, and I knew him. 14 years is a long time. It grays a man, and it cuts lines in him, and it puts a weight in the shoulders that wasn't there when he was young. But I knew him the way you know a song you have not heard since you were a boy, not the words maybe, but the shape of it, the place in the chest where it lands. I knew the set of those shoulders. I had watched them ride away from this exact bank 14 springs before, and I had been the one to load the satchel that ruined his life, though neither of us knew it yet. "Evening," he said, when the gelding had climbed up onto the flat ground by the rail. He did not get down. He looked at me a moment longer than a stranger would, and then he looked away, and I understood he did not know me, or did not let himself, and I was glad of it, because I had not yet decided what I was going to do. "Evening," I said. "Long ride." "Long enough." He looked up the trail toward the town, toward the lamps just coming on in the windows. "This Cobb's ferry." As if he did not know. As if he had not been born not 8 miles up that very trail. But I let him have it. A man comes back to a place he ran from. He is entitled to come back as a stranger if that is the only way his pride will let him through the door. "It is," I said. "Crossing's a dime. Stables full but the lean-tos dry. There's beds at the Vance house up the rise if you're stopping, and supper if you're hungry." I watched his face when I said the name. I am an old man, and watching faces is most of what I have left to do, and I have grown good at it over a long life of palling people across a river and back. I saw it land. I saw it go through him like the cold water had gone through the horse. The Vance house. He had not asked, and I had not needed to say it, and we both knew that I had said it on purpose. "Vance," he said. "Just the one word, careful, the way you'd set down something you were afraid would break." "Adeline Vance keeps it now," I said. "Has since old Tom passed. 8 years now I make it." He sat very still on the gray horse. The river went by behind us, loud with snowmelt, the same river that had taken everything from him 14 years before, and he did not know it, and I did, and I held my tongue, because some things a man has to come to in his own time or they do him no good at all. "She keep it alone?" he asked. He tried to make it sound like nothing. He made a poor job of it. And there it was, the whole question of his life, folded up small and tossed out careless, like a man throwing a stone he doesn't want anyone to see him aim. Did she keep it alone? Was there a husband? Were there children with another man's chin and another man's name? Had the 14 years he'd spent telling himself she was lost to him been the simple truth, or had they been the cruelest waste a man ever made of his one life? I could have ended it right there. God forgive me, I have thought about that often since, how I had it in my hand on that porch in that April light, and I held it. I could have said, Asa Holt, she keeps it alone. She has kept it alone these 14 years. She has turned down every man in 3 counties, and she walks down to this water every evening of her life and looks at the far bank like she's waiting for it to give something back. I could have said it and saved them both a deal of grief. But I will tell you why I didn't, and you will think less of me, and you will be right too. I didn't, because I was a coward, and because the truth of what she was waiting on had my own guilt sewn all through it, and an old man's guilt is a hard thing to take out into the open and lay on a porch rail in the light. So all I said was, "She keeps it alone." And I watched that go into him too, and I could not read what it did, because his face had closed up like a fist. "I'll take the lean-to," he said, "not the house." He swung down then, heavy and stiff from the ride, and led the gray toward the stable, and I sat on my porch and watched him go, a big graying man walking back into the town he'd left as a boy, and I thought, well, Harlan, you have got 14 years of being a coward to answer for, and it looks like the river has decided you'll answer for it now. But you want to understand it, you have to go back to before. Asa Holt was a Holt off the high ground east of the Antler, the second son of a hard, land-poor man who ran cattle on grass that was mostly rock, and Asa came down to Cobb's Ferry the way all the young men did, for the dances and the work and the chance to see somebody who wasn't kin. He was big even then, and quiet, with a way of standing back at the edge of a thing and watching it that made some folks take him for slow and made the ones who knew better take him for deep. He could break a horse without breaking its spirit, and he could shoe one, and he could read sign across hard ground better than men twice his age, and he had hands that were gentle on everything but his own pride, which he carried like a man carries a full water bucket up a hill, careful and grim and a little ridiculous. Adeline Vance was old Tom Vance's only living child. Tom kept the relay station and the ferry before me. I was his clerk then, his hired boy, 18 years old and full of myself, sleeping in the loft over the mail room and waking before light to grain the relay teams. Addie was a year younger than me and a year older than nothing scared her. She'd lost her mother to the fever when she was small, and she'd grown up half wild and wholly capable in a house full of men passing through. And by the time she was a young woman she could keep the books and run the desk and quiet a drunk drover with a look and harness a fresh team in the dark. And she did all of it without any fuss, the way her father had taught her, because to the Vances work was just the shape that love took when there was no time to say it plain. She and Asa, Lord, I had a front seat to it, and it was like watching weather come up over the range. You could see it a long way off, and there was nothing to do but stand in it when it got to you. It started, as those things do, over nothing. He came in off a cattle drive with his wages and a tear in his coat, and she sewed the tear because the seamstress was abed, and the whole time she sewed it he stood there holding his arm out stiff as a fence post and turning the color of a sunset, and she pretended not to notice, and I pretended not to notice them both, and old Tom came through and looked at the pair of them and went out again, shaking his head and grinning into his beard. After that Asa found a great deal of reason to be at Cobb's Ferry. His coat was forever needing mending. His horse was forever throwing a shoe within sight of the station. He took to riding the 8 miles down in the evening on no errand at all, and sitting on the porch rail where I sit now, and the two of them would talk in that low, going nowhere way that young people talk when the talk is not the point. I'd hear them through the open window over my ledgers. They were not soft people, either of them, and so they were soft with each other in a hard, sideways fashion, teasing, contradicting, daring. She told him he sat a horse like a sack of meal. He told her she kept her books like a pirate. They neither of them ever once said the thing they meant, because in those days in that country you did not say it, you let it build in you like water behind a beaver dam until the day came that the dam broke or you died old and dry with it still pent up inside you. I want you to understand that this was not a small thing. People nowadays talk about young love like it is a fever that passes. It is not always so. Some of it is the realest thing that ever happens to a person, the truest reading they will ever get of who they are. And then the world comes along with its weather and its accidents and its rivers and washes it away. And the person spends the rest of a long life living next to the dry bed of it, knowing exactly how deep it ran. That was Asa and Addie. Anyone with eyes could see it. And the trouble, the thing that set the whole tragedy turning, was that Asa Holt was poor, and his pride could not stand it. He came to Old Tom in the spring of the year. I remember it was spring because the cottonwoods down by the ferry were just gone to that thin green that doesn't last a week. And he asked, hat in his hands, for the right to court Adeline proper, with marriage at the end of it. I was at my desk. I heard it through the door. Tom Vance was a fair man and not a cruel one, and he did not say no. But he said the thing that a careful father says, which is harder than no, because it leaves the door open and the cold coming in under it. He said, Asa, I have got nothing against you. You are a good hand and an honest one, but my girl has had a hard enough life as it is, and I will not see her go to a man who cannot keep her off the rocks. You have got no land of your own, and your daddy's got nothing to leave you. Come back when you have got something to stand on, and you will have my blessing, and I'll dance at the wedding. That was all. It was kindly meant. But Asa Holt heard it the way a proud poor man hears everything, which is as a judgment on his whole self, and it lodged in him, and it would not come out. He came down to the station that night, and he and Addie walked along the river in the dusk, and I was pawing a late drover across, and I saw them, two shapes against the last light, close and not touching the way they always were. And I heard her voice come across the water, not the words, just the rise and the fall of it, arguing, pleading, and his, low and stubborn underneath. I learned later, years later, when she finally told it to me, the only time she ever told it, what was said. He told her he meant to go out to the new range to the west, where a man with a strong back and no fear could put together a herd of his own in a few years, where the grass was free for the taking, and a poor man could make himself into a man worth marrying. He told her he would not come to her as a beggar. He would come back able to put a roof over her that her father couldn't sneer at, and not before. And this is the part that breaks my old heart even now. She told him she did not want a roof. She wanted him. She told him she'd marry him that very week and live in a sod dugout on his daddy's worst rock and count herself lucky, and that the going away was his pride talking and not his heart, and that pride was a cold thing to lie down with of a night. But he had set himself, and a man like that once set is like a post sunk in stone. He told her to wait for him. 3 years, he said, 4 at the most. He would write. He swore he would write every chance a rider went west to east, and she was to write him back through the army post out past the breaks, and when he had his stake he would come back across that river and marry her in front of the whole town, and Old Tom could dance or not as he pleased. She said, and she told me this with her face still as the river on a windless day, 8 years after, she said, and what if the writing don't get through, Asa, out there? What if a letter takes 6 months or never comes at all? How will we know? And he said the thing that doomed them. He said, if you don't hear from me, you'll know it's because I'm dead, because nothing else would stop me writing to you. And if I don't hear from you, and here he tried to make a joke of it, the great fool, the way frightened young men do, I'll know you came to your senses and married the banker's son. She did not laugh. She told me she did not laugh. She said, don't you dare say that. Don't you put that in the world. I will not marry the banker's son. I will not marry anybody. I will be standing on that bank when you ride back across if it takes me till I'm gray. And he kissed her, the once, she said, the only once. And the next morning he rode west off the far bank with his bedroll and his daddy's old rifle and $40. And she stood on the near bank. And I poled the ferry. And I watched her watch him go until the gray of him was lost in the gray of the morning. And then she went up to the house and put on her apron and kept the books, because that was the shape her love took when there was nothing to be done. She did not cry where I could see. I want that understood. She was not a woman who fell apart. She went on. That is the part the world never credits in a woman who waits. They think she sits and pines. Addie Vance did not pine. She ran a station. She fed 40 travelers a week and harnessed teams and quieted drunks and buried her father when his heart gave out and took over the whole concern and made it pay better than Tom ever had. She raised 2 orphan boys the cholera left at the ferry, raised them up and saw them off into the world like they were her own. She taught half the children in that valley their letters at the kitchen table on winter evenings. She built a life with both hands, a good and useful and respected life, and the waiting was only one room of it, the back room, the one she went into alone in the evenings when the work was done, walking down to the water to look at the far bank. She just never let go. That is different from pinning. Pinning is weak. What she did was the strongest thing I ever watched a person do, which was to keep a door open for 14 years in the teeth of every reason to shut it. But now I have to tell you about the letters, and about the flood, and about my own hands, and it is the part I have carried longest and told least. He wrote, "That is the thing nobody knew but me, and I only knew it after." Asa Holt was a man of his word the way the river is wet. It was simply his nature. It could not be otherwise, and he wrote to her. The first year, 3 letters came east through the army post, addressed to Miss Adeline Vance, Cobb's Ferry, in a big, careful hand that had plainly cost the writer hours by firelight. I know there were 3 because 3 came through clean and she had them, read soft and folded down to nothing from handling, the corners gone furry, the ink near rubbed away from her thumb passing over the lines. He told her about the country out west. He told her the grass was belly-high and free, and he'd thrown in with 2 other men, and they had 100 head already, and it was coming. It was coming faster than he'd hoped. 2 years maybe, and he'd be back. He told her, once, just once at the bottom of the 3rd letter, like a man dropping his guard, that he thought of her at the turn of every day, morning and evening, and that he had carved her a comb out of a piece of cow horn on the long nights, and he was saving it to put in her hair himself. She wrote back. She told me she wrote every week, whether a rider was going or not, and saved them up and sent a fat packet whenever the mail went west. She told him about the station and the orphan boys and her father's failing heart and the new schoolhouse and the price of grain, all the small, true freight of a life, and at the bottom of every one she wrote the same line. She told me, the same 5 words every single time, so that if only one of all those letters ever reached him, he would have it. I am still here, waiting. And then came the spring of the high water. You have to know what the antler is in a hard snowmelt year. It is not the tame brown thing you saw the cattleman ford this evening. In a big melt it comes up 10 feet in a night, the color of a plowed field, full of whole trees turning over slow like the hands of a drowning man, and it takes out the ferry cable and the lower corral, and once, the year I'm telling of, it took out the lower road and the willow flat and half the Peterson place, cattle and chickens and a smokehouse, all of it gone down river in the dark. The mail came in that evening on the westbound coach just ahead of the worst of it. I was 21 then, and full of myself still, and quick, too quick, the way young men are who have not yet had the thing happen that teaches them to be slow. The coach driver, Gus Henley, dead now 30 years, rest him, was wild to get across before the water came up over the ford, because if he didn't make the crossing that night he'd be stuck on the wrong bank a week. And the eastbound coach was due in on the far side, and the 2 coaches swapped mail at the crossing. That was the way of it. The westbound carried mail going west, and the eastbound carried the mail coming east, and I was the boy whose job it was to make the swap, to take the leather satchel of eastbound mail off the incoming coach and put it aboard the one going on east at first light. And in that satchel, that one spring riding east, was a fat packet of Asa Holt's letters, a whole winter of them. He had got snowed in at a line camp through the cold months and had no way to send, and had written all the same, every week, a great stack of them. And when the thaw opened the trail, he'd sent the whole winter's worth at once, addressed to her, and they had come down the line coach by coach all the way to the far bank of the Antler, and they were waiting there in the satchel for the eastbound coach to carry them the last leg into Cobb's Ferry. And in that same satchel, I am near sure, were her letters from the season before, the ones she'd given me to send west, that had not yet gone, that I'd been holding for the next westbound, though that part I have never been able to prove and have spent 30 years telling myself maybe it wasn't so. The water came up in the night. I have gone over it 1,000 times. Gus made his crossing on the westbound just at dark, white-faced and cursing, and the swap was to happen at the relay barn on the near bank. And God help me, I was a boy, and I was tired, and the corral was washing out, and old Tom was shouting for me to help him drag the relay teams up to high ground, and the satchel of eastbound mail was sitting on the seat of the empty coach in the barn, where it would be safe, where it was always safe, until morning. But the barn was not on high ground. Nobody had ever needed it to be. The water had never in living memory come up past the lower corral, and it came up that night past the lower corral and past the barn and into the barn, 4 feet deep and running, and it floated that empty coach off its wheels and turned it over against the doorframe and burst it open. And when the gray light came and the water dropped and we waded in to see what we'd lost, the seat was bare and the satchel was gone. Gone down river with the smokehouses and the chickens and the Peterson cattle, gone to wherever the antler takes the things it takes, which is to say gone for good and all. I told old Tom. Tom told the postmaster's man when he came through, and there was a form filled out and a notice posted, lost in flood, the spring mail, and the world being what it was then, a hard, wide, slow world where a letter was a thing of faith more than certainty. That was the end of it. Nobody knew whose letters they'd been. A satchel of mail was just a satchel of mail to a postmaster's man. Nobody knew that the whole future of 2 human souls had been in that leather bag, riding the floodwater out to the sea. But I knew Addie had given me letters to send. And I knew a packet had come for her on the eastbound the day before the water. I'd carried it off the coach myself, a fat one in a big, careful hand, and set it in the satchel for the morning sort, because the morning sort was when I separated the through mail from the local, and the local went up to the house, and I had not done the sort yet. The water came first. So when she came down to the station 3 days later, white and quiet, and asked me, for she always asked, every coach every week, if anything had come for her, I stood in the doorway of the ruined barn with the mud still drying on my boots, and I looked at that good waiting woman, and I did not have the courage. I did not have the courage to say, "A packet came for you in his hand, and I let the river take it." I did not have the courage to be the boy who drowned her one happiness in a flooded barn. So I said, "Nothing, Addie, nothing came." And that was the lie, the only one that ever mattered. I told it once, and then I had to keep telling it week after week, coach after coach, year after year. Nothing came, nothing came, nothing came, because to take it back later was worse than to have told it at all, or so my cowardice told me. And the lie set up like mortar between us until I'd built a whole wall out of it without ever meaning to lay a single brick. And on the far side of the world, in a line camp out past the breaks, a young man waited through that summer and the next for the letters that did not come, because they were at the bottom of the antler, and the silence ate at him exactly the way he'd promised her it would, and he reached at last the only conclusion his proud, wounded heart would let him reach. She had come to her senses. She had married the banker's son. And he stopped writing because what was the use, and he stayed out west, and he put together his herd and lost it and put together another, and he grew hard and gray and rich and alone, and he did not come back for 14 years. So now you understand the porch. You understand why the river felt to me, that April evening, like a thing that had come around at last to collect a debt. I did not sleep that night. I lay in my room over the station and listened to the antler running high outside the window, and I thought about the big graying man asleep in my lean-to who had believed for 14 years, that the woman a quarter mile up the rise had thrown him over, when the truth was she had stood on the bank every evening of those years waiting for the far shore to give him back. And I thought about how I, Harlan Pike, was the only living man who held both ends of that truth, and how I had been too craven to tie them together when they were young, and how here they both were, old now or near it, in the same square mile for the first time since the flood, and how if I held my tongue one more time they would pass each other like 2 coaches on a dark road and go on alone to their separate graves, and the river and the boy I'd been would have won, finally and forever. I am not a brave man. I want that on the record. I have poled a river 50 years and never once been brave. But there comes a night to a coward, if he lives long enough, when he sees plain that the cowardly thing and the easy thing have at last come apart, that going on as he has gone on is no longer the path of least trouble but the path of most, and that the only rest left to him is on the far side of the hard thing. That night was mine. I got up before light. I did not go to the lean-to. I went up the rise to the Vance house, where the kitchen lamp was already lit because Addie Vance had been getting up before light her whole life, and I knocked on the door I had been carrying a lie through for 14 years, and when she opened it, in her apron with flour on her hands, and saw my face, she went still. "Harlan," she said, "what's wrong? Who's hurt?" "Nobody's hurt," I said. "Addie, sit down. I've got to tell you a thing, and it's a bad thing, and it's an old thing, and it's mine, and you're going to hate me for it, and you'll be right too. And I've put it off 14 years, and I'm not putting it off another hour. But I will not give you the whole of what I said to her at that kitchen table, because some of it was just a frightened old man's blubbering, and it doesn't bear repeating. But I told her the truth of it. I told her about the packet that came in his hand the day before the water. I told her about the satchel in the barn, and the morning sort I never made and the flood that took it. I told her, and this was the hardest, harder even than the rest that I'd known, that I'd carried his letter off the coach with my own hands and let the river have it, and then stood in her father's doorway and told her nothing came, and gone on telling her nothing came every week for years because I was too small a man to take it back. And I told her the last thing, the thing I'd worked out only that sleepless night, lying in the dark doing the cruel arithmetic. I said, "Addie, he wrote you. He wrote you that whole winter, a stack of them, that's what was in that packet. He didn't stop because he stopped caring. He stopped because the letters never came, and he thought you'd done the thing he was always afraid of. He thought you married Merrill Quint. He's thought it 14 years. I had to stop and get my breath. He's down in my lean-to right now, Addie. He rode in last evening. He's come back, and he doesn't know any of it. He thinks you're some other man's wife. He wouldn't even sleep in the house." She did not say anything for a long time. The lamp burned. Outside the window the light was coming gray up over the river. Her hands were flat on the table, white with flour, and they did not shake, and her face did not break, and I thought, the way I had thought 14 years before watching her watch him ride away, "She is the strongest creature I have ever known, and I have wronged her worse than any man alive." When she finally spoke, it was not what I expected. I expected fury, and I deserved fury, and I had braced for it the way you brace for cold water. What she said instead was the worst thing she could have said, because it was quiet, and it was not about me. "All those years," she said, "I thought he forgot me." She looked at her flower-white hands. "I made my peace with it, you understand. I made my peace with being the woman a man could forget. I built a whole life on the back of that, Harlan. I learned to carry it. I told myself it was no shame to be the one who waited, even if he didn't, that the waiting was mine and it didn't need his permission." Her voice did not rise. It just got very level, the way the river gets level and deep and dangerous when it's running its highest. "And you're telling me he didn't forget me. You're telling me there was no peace to make. You're telling me all of it, all 14 years, was a barn full of water and a boy who didn't sort the mail." "Yes," I said, "I'm telling you that." And then she did cry, finally, the only time I ever saw it. 2 tears that ran down through the flour on her face and dropped onto the table, and she let them. She did not wipe them. She just sat and let them fall, and I sat across from her and let her hate me, which was the only useful thing I had to offer, and it was little enough. After a while she stood up. She wiped her face with the back of her wrist and left a streak of flour across it and did not care. "Does he know it was you?" she said. "That lost the satchel." "No," I said. "Nobody ever knew whose letters were in it. I'm the only one knows. I'll tell him too if you want. I'll tell him this hour. I'll tell the whole town if it'll do you any good. I'm done being the man who knows and doesn't say." She looked at me a long moment, and there was something working behind her eyes that I could not read, and at last she said, "No, you won't tell him." And before I could protest she went on, Because if you go down there and tell that man the whole sad truth in a rush, Harlan, he is going to do exactly what he did 14 years ago. He is going to feel like a fool and a beggar and a man who threw away his life on a misunderstanding, and his pride is going to take that and turn it into a reason to get back on that gray horse and ride west and never be seen again. I know him. I knew him better than anybody, and 14 years won't have changed the iron in him. She drew a breath. If he's to stay, he has to choose it, not be argued into it by a guilty old man and a sad story. He has to look at me, the woman I am now, not the girl he left, and choose it with his eyes open. So you'll hold your tongue one more day, and this time you'll hold it because I'm asking you to, and that's a different thing entirely. I have thought ever since that this was the moment I understood, truly understood, why a man like Asa Holt would ride west and break a herd and build a fortune just for the chance to come back and stand worthy in front of her. Because she was, even wronged, even with the tears not dry on her face, the most clear-eyed and fully her own self person in that whole valley, and she had just taken the worst news of her life, and in the space of 1 cup of cold coffee, bent it to her own purpose. She was not going to be reunited. She was going to do the reuniting on her terms or not at all. "All right," I said. "What do you want me to do?" "Nothing," she said. "You've done enough for 14 years. Go pull your ferry." And then at the door with her hand on the frame, not looking back at me, "Harlan," a pause, "I'm not going to forgive you today. I don't know if I'll forgive you at all. But I'm glad you finally told me. There's a difference between those two things, and you'll have to live in the gap of it same as me." Then she went to wash the flour off her face, and I went down to pole my ferry, and I will tell you that the gap she spoke of is a place I have lived in every day since, and it is a fair sentence, and I have served it without complaint. But here is what she did. I had it after, partly from her and partly from him and partly from my own 2 eyes, because the station window looks right up the rise, and I am, as I have said, a man who watches. She did not go down to the lean-to. She did not send for him. She let him be a stranger the way he'd asked to be. What she did was put the word out, quiet, through the boy who carried her eggs and the woman who took in her washing, that the Vance house was hearing a man who could handle stock and fix what needed fixing, room and board and wages, ask at the kitchen. It was the most ordinary thing in the world. Half the men passing through Cobb's Ferry were looking for a week's work, and the Vance station always needed a strong back. There was nothing in it a proud man could refuse on grounds of pity, because it was a job, plain and square, and the wages were fair and not a penny over. And Asa Holt, who had come to sell his cattle at the railhead 2 days east and had meant to be gone by the week's end, who had ridden into Cobb's Ferry telling himself it was only because the trail ran through it, and for no other reason in the world, heard about the work at the Vance house, where Adeline Vance kept the station alone, and he did not ride on. He told me much later what he told himself. He told himself it was the wages. He told himself a few weeks' work would be money in his pocket against the long ride home and no harm in it. He told himself he just wanted to see from a distance, like a man looks at a house he used to live in, what had become of her, and of the place, and that he could do it cool and clear and then ride off cured. A man can tell himself a great deal. The truth was simpler, and he was not equal to it yet. The truth was that he could no more have ridden away from that rise, knowing she was on it, than the antler could run uphill. He came up to the kitchen door to ask after the work, hat in his hands, the way he'd come to her father's door 15 years before, and Adeline Vance opened it and looked at him. I'd give a great deal to have seen that. I only had it from her, and she was sparing with it. She said she'd thought she was ready, and she was not. She said it was like opening a door you've opened 10,000 times and finding the whole of your young life standing on the step in a worn-out coat with gray in his beard. She said her first feeling, before the love and before the grief and before the anger, was a kind of terrible tenderness, that he had got old, that the years had used him hard, That the boy who'd been so sure he could go make himself worthy had spent his worth out there on the empty grass and come home with lines in his face and nothing in his arms. But she had decided how this was to go, and she held to it because she was Addie Vance. She did not throw her arms around him. She did not weep. She did not say his name like it cost her anything. She looked at the big graying man on her step and she said, plain as anything, "You're the hand asking about the work." And he said, "I am, ma'am," and his voice, she said, was not steady. And she said, and here is the iron of her, the thing I loved her for, the thing that saved them both, she said, "Do I know you?" She gave him the same gift I'd given him on the porch, but she gave it on purpose and for a better reason. She let him be a stranger. She let him into the house as a stranger, with no 14 years lying across the threshold, no accusation, no claim. She gave them both clean ground to stand on. Because she had understood, sitting at that kitchen table with the flour on her hands, that the wreck of their young love could not be repaired, that you cannot unflood a barn or untell a lie or give a man back 14 years, but that two grown people standing on clean ground in the middle of their one life might, if they were careful and lucky and brave, build something new on the spot where the old thing had stood. Not the same. New. And that the only way to get there was for him to choose her now, with open eyes, and not be hauled back into a grave he thought he'd dug. So she said, "Do I know you?" And he looked at her and something crossed his face, the wild hope, maybe, that she'd been hit on the head and lost the years, that he could just walk back into the house of his life and no harm done. And then the killing certainty that no, she'd simply forgotten him. He'd been so little to her that 14 years had wiped him clean off her slate. And he took the second one, the cruel one, the way he always took the cruel one, and he said, "No, ma'am, don't reckon you do. I'm just passing." And she said, "Well, the bunk's in the barn and there's stew on the stove. Stock wants feeding morning and night and the lower fence is down. We'll see how you do." And that is how Asa Holt came to spend the spring of his 40th year working as a hired hand for the woman he had loved his whole life, both of them pretending to be strangers, while an old guilty ferryman watched from his window and did not say a word. I will not pretend I understood while it was happening all of what she was about. I thought at first that she was being cruel or proud or punishing him, and I thought it was a hard game to play with a man's heart. I told her so once across the ferry rail low when he was out of earshot mending the cable. I said, "Addie, this is a hard road you've put him on. Why not just tell him?" And she said, not looking at me, watching him work, "Because, Harlan, if I tell him, he'll love the girl I was. He'll spend whatever years are left to us loving a ghost and grieving the flood. I don't want to be loved for who I was at 20. I've earned who I am. If he's going to love me, he's going to fall for the woman feeding stock and keeping books and burying her dead and raising other folks' orphans, the actual woman, the one who's still here. And then when he loves her, me, the real me, the now me, then I'll tell him the rest, and it'll be a wound we heal together instead of a grave he runs from. That's not cruelty. That's the only chance we've got." She paused, and then she said the thing I have never forgotten. "I waited 14 years for him to come back. I'm not going to lose him in the first week to a story about how sad it all was. Sad won't hold a man like Asa. Only true will." And I held my tongue, and I watched, and I learned more from that woman about love in one spring than I had learned in 60 years of living next to a river. It was a slow thing and a beautiful one, and I had the best seat in the valley. He was a good hand. Of course he was a good hand. He'd built 2 herds out of nothing on the empty range. He had the lower fence up in 3 days and the corral rebuilt in a week, and the relay barn shored up onto a stone foundation 2 feet higher than the old one, so that no flood would ever float it off again, though he could not have known why that drove the old ferryman watching from the window to go out behind the woodpile and stand a while with his hand over his mouth. He fixed things that had been broken for years. He gentled a string of half-wild relay horses that nobody else could put a harness on. He worked from dark to dark and said little and watched everything, the way he'd always done, and the men who came through took him for slow, and the ones who knew better took him for deep. and in the evenings, when the work was done, the two of them would end up on the porch. It started over the books. She kept the station accounts, and he, it turned out, had a head for figures from running his outfits. And one evening she was cursing over a column that wouldn't balance, and he leaned over careful, a hand's breadth of clean air between them, two strangers, and found her error in about 4 seconds. And she said he kept books like a pirate, and he said she sat a chair like a sack of meal, and neither of them so much as breathed for a moment, because the old words had come out of them without thinking. The very words from 15 years gone, and they each saw the other go still. And then she laughed. She told me it was the first true laugh she'd had in longer than she could say. And the danger passed, and the dam held, but the water behind it, oh, the water behind it had risen. After that they took to the porch most evenings. They talked the way they'd always talked, low and going nowhere, the talk not the point. He told her about the West, the bigness of it, the loneliness, a man and his horse and 1,000 miles of grass, and the way a fellow could ride a whole day and not have a thought worth keeping. She told him about the station, the orphan boys she'd raised, both gone now, one to the railroad, one to a farm of his own, both writing her letters she kept in a tin, the children she'd taught, her father's last bad winter. They were, the both of them, taking the measure of who the other had become across 14 years, and what they found, I think, was that they liked it. Not the memory, the person. He came to like the woman she'd made of herself out of hard use and lonely evenings, the steel and the dry humor and the deep stubborn kindness of her. And she came to, well, she came to love the man, the actual graying man with the lines and the slow, careful hands and the buried tenderness, more than she'd ever loved the boy, because the boy had been a promise and the man was a fact, and Addie Vance had always set more store by facts. I watched the door open in him by inches. I watched the hard set of his shoulders ease. I watched him laugh once at something she said, a real laugh, surprised out of him, and clap his hand over it like a man catching something he'd dropped. I watched him start to leave the comb out. The comb. I have to tell you about the comb, because it is the hinge the whole thing turned on, and because it broke me a little watching it. He had it still. The cowhorn comb he'd carved her in the line camp 15 years before, the one he'd told her in his lost letter he was saving to put in her hair himself. He'd carried it all that time, all through the building of 2 herds and the losing of one, all through the long hardening of him, in a little oilskin packet in his war bag. And I think it was the one soft place left in him, the one thing he hadn't been able to make himself throw on the fire, even believing as he did that she'd married another man before the ink was dry on it. I knew about the comb because I saw it. He'd taken to working on it again in the evenings after she'd gone up to bed, and he was alone in the lamplight by the barn, finishing it, smoothing it, working a little vine of leaves along the spine of it with the point of his knife. I came on him at it one night, going for the late mail, and he startled and made to hide it, and then, seeing it was just the old ferryman, didn't bother. He held it out on his big palm. It was a fine thing. 15 years of a man's grief and faithfulness worked into a piece of horn, no longer than your hand. For your woman, I said like a fool because I knew, but I was playing my part. And he looked at it and he said, was going to be, long time ago, for a girl that married somebody else. He turned it over. Don't know why I keep it. Going to give it to her now, I said, and I meant Addie, and I held my breath. He was quiet, the lamp hissed, and then he said the thing that told me she'd been right about everything, that her hard, slow, patient road had been the only road. He said, been thinking on it. And he stopped and started over, careful like a man stepping on river ice. The woman that keeps this place, Adeline, she puts me in mind of, and he stopped again, and he could not say it, and his jaw worked, and at last he said, low, almost angry, it don't matter who she puts me in mind of. That's done, she's her own. I got no claim to lay anything to rest on her account. He put the comb away. I'll be moving on when the work's done. And I went up to bed and I lay awake and I thought, it is close now. He loves her. He loves the now her, the real her, just as Addie wanted, and his pride is going to tell him to ride off and grieve a ghost forever rather than reach for a happiness he doesn't believe he's allowed. The flood is going to win after all, 14 years on, not by water this time, but by a proud man's habit of taking the cruelest reading of every silence. And I am going to have to decide, one more time, whether to be a coward. It came to its head on a Sunday in the spring dusk, down by the river, almost on the spot where they'd walked 15 years before. I saw the start of it from the porch, and I want you to know I did not mean to watch the rest. But the water carries voices, as I've told you, and once it started I could not have left if the station had been on fire. He told her at supper that the work was done, the fence up, the barn shored, the horses gentled, and that he'd be drawing his wages and riding on in the morning, east to the railhead and then west, home, such as home was. He said it flat, like a man reading a bill of lading, and she'd nodded and said that was fine and the wages were in the tin, and that had been that, and I'd thought my heart would crack watching the two of them eat the rest of that supper in a silence you could have poled a ferry across. But after, in the dusk, she came and found him where he was rubbing down the gray for the morning, and she said, I had this from her, and her voice still shook telling it years later, she said, walk down to the water with me before you go, for old times. And he said, careful, I don't have any old times here, ma'am. And she said, no, but I do, walk with me anyhow. And he walked with her, down past the lower corral he'd rebuilt, down to the bank where the cottonwoods were just gone to that thin green that doesn't last a week, the same green as 15 springs before, and the antler ran by them lower now, gentle, the snowmelt spent, the same water that had taken everything turned mild and bright in the last of the light. And she stopped at the edge of it and looked across at the far bank, the way she'd looked across at it 10,000 evenings, and he stood beside her, a hand's breadth of clean air between them, two strangers, and the water carried it to me on the porch. She said, I'm going to tell you a story, and then you can ride off in the morning if you still want to, and I won't say another word to stop you. And she told him. She told him all of it, standing there at the water in the dark coming down. She told him she was the girl. She told him she'd never married, never come close, that the banker's son had asked and so had a dozen others, and she'd turned them all because there was only one man she'd ever stood at this water waiting for, and she'd be damned if she'd give the place beside her to a lesser one out of loneliness. She told him about the letters, his 3 that she'd worn near to dust with reading, and her own, the ones with I am still here, waiting at the bottom of every page, that she'd written and sent into the silence for 2 years before she let herself stop. And then she told him the thing I'd told her at the kitchen table, the packet in his hand, the satchel in the barn, the flood, the lie a frightened boy had told and gone on telling. And she said it was nobody's sin but the river's and a child's, and that there was no one left to blame and no good in blaming. You didn't stop writing because you stopped loving me, she said, and I didn't stop answering because I married Merrill Quint. We stopped because a barn full of water came between us in the dark and neither of us ever knew. 14 years, Asa. 14 years we each thought the other one let go, and neither of us did, neither of us ever did. I could not see his face. I could only see the 2 shapes against the last light, close and not touching the way they always were. And there was a silence so long that I thought, this is it. This is where the iron in him wins. This is where the flood takes them the second time. And then I heard him make a sound I have never forgotten, an old hard man's sound, a sound like something breaking that should have broken years before, and he said, his voice gone all to pieces, you waited, just that. You waited. I waited, she said. I'd have come back, he said, if I'd had one word, and I'd have left the herd to rot and rode straight through. You know that, you have to know that. I know that, she said, I know it now. And there was another silence, and then he said the thing his whole proud closed-up self had been keeping behind the dam for 15 years, and it came out broken and plain and not careful at all at last, finally not careful. I never stopped. Out there. All of it. The herds, the money, the long, empty years. I told myself it was for nothing, that I'd built it all for a woman that forgot me, and I hated it, and I couldn't put it down. I carried your comb 15 years thinking you were another man's wife. I'm 40 years old, Addie, and I've got gray in my beard and a bad hip and 100 miles of nothing behind me, and I never once, not one single day, stopped. And I saw the hand's breadth of clean air between the two shapes close, finally, after 15 years, and become no air at all. She told him that night by the water, what she'd told me at the kitchen table, that she didn't want to be loved for the girl she'd been, that she'd earned who she was, and that if he loved her it had to be the woman she was now, the one who fed the stock and kept the books and buried her dead and raised the world's orphans, the one still here. And he told her, and I believe him, because I'd watched it happen with my own eyes across that whole long spring, that it was her he'd fallen for, this time, the now her, that he'd half decided to ride away precisely because he'd gone and loved a woman he thought he had no right to, a hired man falling for the mistress of the house, and that the girl by the river 15 years gone had been a dream he'd grieved, but the woman across the supper table was a fact he could not live without, and that Addie Vance had always set more store by facts. She said yes, but she said it her own way, on her own terms, the way she did everything. She did not say it like a woman rescued or a wait rewarded. She said it like a woman making the one big free choice of her life with her eyes wide open. She told him she'd not give up the station, that it was hers and she'd built it and she meant to keep running it, and he could be her husband but he'd not be her keeper, and the books would stay in her hand. He said that suited him fine. He'd run cattle on the high ground and leave the figures to the pirate. She told him she came with the orphan boys' letters in a tin, and the schoolchildren on winter evenings, and her father's grave on the rise, and 14 years of a life he hadn't been part of, and that he'd have to take all of it, the whole woman, or none. He said he'd take all of it. He said he'd take the whole woman if it took him the rest of his life to deserve the part of her he'd missed. And then, and this is the part that I keep, this is the part I take out and look at when the cold gets into my old bones of an evening. He reached into his coat and took out the oilskin packet, and he took out the cowhorn comb he'd carved 15 years before and finished by lamplight in her barn, and he put it in her hair himself, the way he'd written in a letter that lies at the bottom of the antler to this day, the way he'd promised a girl he thought he'd lost, and he kept the promise to the woman he'd found. Which is the only way an old promise is ever really kept, by being kept to who a person has become. There was a wedding by the river in the early summer, when the cottonwoods were in their full leaf. The whole town came, because the whole town had watched both of them grow old and alone, and had quietly given them up for two of the valley's permanent fixtures, like the ferry and the relay barn. And there is nothing a town loves better than being wrong about a thing like that in a good direction. The preacher married them on the near bank with the water going by bright behind them, and old Tom Vance's grave up on the rise where he could have seen it if the dead can see. And I will tell you, the man danced after all, the way Tom had promised 15 years before, danced at his daughter's wedding the way ghosts dance, which is to say in the gladness of the living who remember them. Asaph finished the cabin. I haven't told you about the cabin. Up on the ridge above the station, 15 years before, in the months when he was courting her and full of hope, he'd started building a house. Their house, the one he meant to bring her to once her father gave his blessing, and he'd got it framed and half-walled before old Tom's careful refusal sent him west, and he'd left it standing there half-built, and it had stood half-built for 15 years, going gray, the frame of a life that didn't happen. A thing the whole town walked past and didn't speak of out of kindness to the woman down at the station. After the wedding he took his tools up the ridge and he finished it. Took him the better part of the summer. He squared the walls he'd raised as a young man and roofed them as an old one, and he hung a door and cut windows that looked down on the river and the ferry and the relay barn on its new high stone, and they moved into it in the fall, the two of them, 15 years late, into the house he'd started for a girl and finished for a woman. I am near the end of my telling, and I find I don't much want to reach it, the way you don't want to reach the end of a good evening. Addie forgave me. I want that set down because I have set down so plainly that I didn't deserve it. It was not quick and it was not cheap. For a long while there was a coolness between us, fair and earned, the gap she'd warned me I'd have to live in. But the spring Asa came back, and the summer of the wedding, and the fall of the cabin, something in all that loosened the knot in her. And one evening late in that year, she came down to the station where I was closing up the books, and she set a covered plate on my desk, supper from her kitchen, the way she'd done 1,000 times before the truth came out and not once after, and she said, "Harlan, the boy in the barn that didn't sort the mail." He was 21, and the water was coming up and old Tom was hollering. I've thought about it a deal. I don't believe there's a soul alive who'd have done different, and I'm tired of you carrying it like you're the only one. The river took those letters, not you. You just couldn't bear to tell a sad girl her one happiness drowned, and then you couldn't bear to take it back, and that's not a sin, Harlan, that's just a tender heart in a coward's coat. She put her hand on my old shoulder. Eat your supper, your family. You always were. Asa says the figures down here are a disgrace, and he aims to fix your books too, the pirate. And that was all. That was how she gave me back 15 years. The same way she did everything, plainly, on her own terms, more generously than was deserved, and with a joke at the end so a proud man wouldn't have to weep in front of her, though I did anyway over a covered plate, an old fool at his desk. They had near 20 years together in the cabin on the ridge. He ran his cattle on the high ground and she ran the station and kept the books, and in the evenings they sat on the porch of the house he'd finished and watched the river go by below, the river that had cost them everything and given them, at the long last, each other. They never had children of their own. They came to it too late for that, but the orphan boys she'd raised came back with families, and the children she'd taught their letters grew up and named their own children after the schoolteacher down at Cobb's Ferry, and the cabin on the ridge was never short of young ones underfoot, so that a man passing might have thought the place had been full of children all its life, and never guessed it had stood half-built and empty for 15 gray years. Asa Holt died first, an old man in his bed in the house he'd built twice, with his wife's hand in his and the river going by below. They say his last words were a joke about her bookkeeping, and I believe it, because that was the shape his love took when there were no other words big enough. She wore the cowhorn comb in her hair to the day she followed him, 3 winters later, and she is buried beside him on the ridge, above the station, above the river, where old Tom is, where they can all of them see the water if the dead can see. And I think they can. I have come to think they can, because I am the last of that whole story left alive and somebody has to. I am very old now. I have run the ferry and the relay at Cobb's Crossing for 50 years and I expect I will die at it. The mail comes by rail mostly now, and the coaches are nearly done, and one of these years there'll be a bridge across the Antler and no need of a ferryman at all, and that will be the end of me and my kind, and I don't mind it much. But of an evening, when the work is done, I still walk down to the water, the way she used to, and I look at the far bank. And I think about a proud poor boy who rode off across it, certain that the only honest way to love a woman was to leave her, and the woman who stood on this side of it and waited half her life with her eyes open and her hands full of work, and a barn full of water in the dark that nearly won, and didn't. People will tell you a love like that is a young person's foolishness, a fever that passes. Don't you believe them? I have watched the whole arc of one, from the green of the cottonwoods to the grave on the ridge, and I am here to tell you it is the realest thing there is, and the most patient, and the strongest, strong enough to wait out 14 years and a flood and a coward's lie and a proud man's iron, and to come good at the last, late, but true, on the bank of a river, in the thin green light of a spring that doesn't last a week and doesn't need to. She waited, he came back, the water gave them up at last. And an old man pushes his pole into the river of an evening, and the far bank comes a little closer, and that, I have learned, is all any of us are doing, Every day of our lives, piling toward the far bank, hopping the one we love is standing on it still. She was, he came, it was enough.